Well, it is my huge pleasure to have my friend Matt Marsh join me on the Squirrel Pod. I first met Matt when he got in touch with me to see if my electric vehicle startup in Shanghai might be interested in sponsoring Formula E. We never had the money for that, but Matt became a great friend. And some of you may remember me writing last year about Matt coming down to Melbourne for the Grand Prix, obviously. And through him, I met the legendary Gunter Steiner. And we were filmed, but by the Netflix crew as we were having our post-game chat. And unfortunately, Matt and I were left on the cutting room floor when it came to season 7 of Drive to Survive. But Matt, you have got some serious credentials in the motorsports world. Why don't you tell everyone about yourself?
Well, that's very kind of you to say that, Rupert. And also, I love the introduction, so thank you for that. The checks in the post, I think, is the way I should say that. No, but I suppose the key things about my background are first Asia, in that I moved to Hong Kong in 1990. And whilst I'm British, I remained British, but Asia has been a sort of defining part, if you like, of my career and motorsport also. So I raced a little bit before I moved out. I raced enough to know that I wasn't very good at it when I was a teenager, and then I started again, having got into a career in telecommunications. I had some money, started going motor racing for fun, and at some point basically thought actually I could probably achieve some things. I could get to race not in Formula One, but I could do things like the Le Mans 24 hours and the other big sports car races where you can take a sort of modicum of talent, a little bit of, let's say, competency behind the wheel, and add to it the fact that you can bring money, and then you become quite an interesting dynamic within a three driver team, for example, at Le Mans. So, not very good at racing, which meant I had to find lots of sponsorship. And then when I stopped racing, I thought, well, the one thing I know about now is the commercial side of motorsport. And obviously knew a lot of people from being a competitor. So why don't I carry on doing the sponsorship work? And was lucky enough then to be hired by a man called Zach Brown, who since I worked for him, after I stopped working for him, actually became very famous because he's now the boss of the McLaren Formula One team, which of course is the current world champion constructor, and spent 7 years working for Zach in his specialist agency before he went to McLaren. And alongside all of that, since 1994, I was covering Formula One. It was kind of a Saturday, Sunday hobby, if you like. At the beginning, I was
This
paid,
was
but
with Fox Sports, right?
it
This was
was. Yeah, we went through Star Sports, ESPN, and then finally Fox Sports Asia. But it was really very complementary to what I was doing. A, when I was trying to find money for myself going racing, the fact that I was the bloke on the telly and also writing for newspapers and magazines and so on meant I could generate some coverage for my sponsors. It was part of the offering, if you like. And then later on, when I'm helping brands look at partnerships in the sport, I've got this quite unusual multi-perspective, which is, I think, really quite valuable. So that's where I've ended up.
well, brilliant. I want to share a pic of last year in Melbourne, and there we go. Business of Speed with Matt Marsh. There's you
Yeah.
with bloody hell. I've got to call Gene Steiner, dear Gunter, and that really led me into what was actually probably my best single stock pick of last year because
Mm.
on the basis of a few conversations and a bit of work after that weekend, I bought some shares in Liberty's Formula One tracking stock,
Mm.
and that's really where I wanted to start with you, and I wanted to start with this quote from the famous Bernie Ecclestone from way before when Liberty bought the business, and he says, "I don't know why people want to get the so-called young generation. What do they want to do? Why do they want to do that? Is that to sell them something? Most of these kids haven't got any money. I'm not interested in tweets, Facebook, and whatever this nonsense is. I'd rather get to the 70-year-old guy who's got plenty of cash." Well, I think that that statement aged rather poorly, given what Liberty's done with the business over the subsequent years. And I'd love to get your take on the revolution and the renaissance of the sport since they took over.
Yeah. Well, we could dig into Bernie a little bit later, perhaps.
Oh no, no,
And
let's start with Bernie. No, let's
well,
start.
okay. So the Bernie part is that he often said things like that. I think he liked tweaking people, and his point wasn't incorrect in that he was much more interested in a somebody who was running a company, a chairman or a CEO of a business who would invest tens of millions of dollars per year on a 5-year contract, than he was in the people that those people were selling to, right? So, he was selling to a small number of key individuals, and then whoever you sell to is kind of up to you. That is typical Bernie. And by the way, super successful, and a lot of people made money around him, not least of which were the team owners who, when he took over the sport, if we take a step back, here's a guy who was in motorsport from the beginning. He was a driver manager in the late 1950s of a British driver called Stuart Lewis Evans, who sadly died in a racing accident. He was then the manager of a man called Jochen Rindt, another person who died sadly in a racing accident, not Bernie's fault, either of those. He was the world champion in 1970, the only posthumous world champion. And Bernie had a Formula 2 team in the late 1960s, which Jochen had raced for, and he then bought the Brabham Formula 1 team in 1972, and they went on to win the world championship twice in 1981 and 83 with Nelson Piquet. So knew what he was doing. And by the way, as part of that was bringing in the cars. Always looked, he was the first guy to make the cars look amazingly beautiful in terms of the aesthetic of the sponsorship on the car. It wasn't a Christmas tree. It had to be, monochrome, monocolors. Anyway, the key point is that he had some sponsors like Martini, Parmalat, Olivetti, and Alfa Romeo, all of which were Italian. I don't know why it was, but for some reason he was able to convince Italians to spend money with him, and maybe it was somewhat a circular deal. So he was very good at that sort of thing. But what he really did with the sport was he recognized that there were a few key players that were controlling it. It was people like Ferrari. So he convinced the smaller teams, the multiple, if you allow me to represent you collectively, we can make things much fairer, give you a better chance of success. So it used to be that the race promoters would dictate who was going to be on the grid. So they go to Ferrari first, and they get 3 or 4 cars from Ferrari, and then by the time it got to our team, they weren't paying us very much start money. So Bernie therefore was able to get those guys on board with him, and he was then able to offset, if you like, the imbalance. He was able also to realize that television was going to be an important part of the future of the money of the sport. So again, what he was able to do was say to the TV companies, I can help you get this, but you need to show every single race rather than just Monaco and the British Grand Prix and so on. So he started to build, if you like, a much better ecosystem, business ecosystem. And then, of course, the key move was when he, through the organization that he had put together, which was the stakeholder organization, he somehow managed to own it, if you like, having got the mandate from the stakeholders. And then he managed to get the commercial rights for Formula One, first for, I think it was 14 years, and then for 100 years. And that was what he essentially sold on.
To CBC.
Yeah, to CBC.
Exactly. CBC initially, yeah.
Yeah. And that was what the business is based on, is having the commercial rights to the Formula One World Championship. And I don't think that, as we're now going to talk about Liberty, it's not entirely different to what Liberty did.
Right.
Because people now say, wow, it's amazing that Liberty have, to your point, they've made Formula One accessible and they've made it approachable. But what they really did was rationalize it. They looked at it, unsurprisingly, Liberty Media came in, and they're an entertainment business. And the key people, Chase Carey, who, had worked for Murdoch at 20th Century Fox, and you don't do that for very long at all if you're not super smart, and Chase is obviously very smart. They would say to anybody who listened, we know nothing about motor racing. And that was kind of their strength, because they knew a lot about entertainment. And they realized the racing's kind of okay, but the entertainment is really fascinating. You've got these 20 athletes, the drivers, who are all mostly attractive. Most of them are attractive in some ways.
Is that a requirement?
Well, I think, no, it isn't. But it just turns out that most, even if it's just because they're super fit, they're relatively young, they live in Monaco, they travel on private jets, they have glamorous girlfriends, they have pet dogs. I mean, it's all great television, right? And if you then put that at the front, it makes it a very, very interesting thing to watch, and people don't have to necessarily watch 2 hours on a Sunday afternoon. You and I, the OGs, I think we call ourselves, or they call us. But it also means that my 14-year-old daughter is no less valuable a fan, and she won't ever watch a full-length Grand Prix. But she's keen to know who's winning, and she'll watch YouTube highlights, which are free, which Bernie would never have done, because his belief at the time was it needs to be restricted access.
Right.
And what the Liberty guys have done is done both. They've kept the restricted access. If you want to be in in the paddock club, it's expensive. If you want to be in the paddock downstairs, the working area with the drivers, it's super expensive because you need to be a sponsor, and as it should be, But at the same time, teenage fans and so on.
Do you think we'd have naturally got to here without a change of leadership?
Maybe, but it would have been much slower, I think.
Right.
Really, because of this point about the perspective, and and it has been a revolution, right? Because there's now 800 million fans. A third of those are new in the last 5 or 6 years. I think that's really something. Um, the other thing is it was augmenting the fan base. They didn't upset the people like you and I. They just added what is a predominantly female and younger audience to the existing more male skewed and older audience, so that now 40% of the audience, so I should say 40% of the fans actually are female. 40% of the fans are in that 16 to 34 age group that brands love. Actually, when Bernie was saying what he was saying, he was tongue in cheek, because brands do love the 16 to 34-year-olds. Because if you can capture those people now, they tend to stay with you through to when they're in
Forever.
their 70s. Yeah, exactly. Um, they By doing all of this and making it super popular, they've also expanded the championship from 20 rounds to 24. What that really means is there were before 20 race promoters paying them a fee of 20 to 50 million per race, to now 24. That's a significant amount of extra money. And there's a
Yeah.
queue, by the way, because countries, cities now see this is a very uh, powerful tool to have a Grand Prix. No surprise that there are four in the Middle East.
Well, absolutely. I mean,
Mm.
and let's just talk about the numbers a little bit. I mean, so the market cap of Formula One, the franchise right now, is $24 billion. Individual teams, I mean, what Ferrari's worth about five, McLaren's four. Sorry, Mercedes is about four. Reckon McLaren's back up at that level now after
Mm.
the past year. But even the minnows are worth $1 billion now. I mean, what do the economics look like for some of those smaller teams? And you know, if they, if you know, if there was a sort of freely traded stock on the individual teams, do you think it would be easy to value them, or is it so much? Is there so much emotion in terms of how and sort of bragging rights of owning? It's like owning any sports team. It's always the wrong price.
Yeah, I think the key part, and it goes back to the genius of Chase Carey, was that he was able to convince these 10 teams, or let's say the bigger ones. Ferrari always had a bonus and still does. When they divide the money that's generated by the sport, Ferrari always got an extra amount for being Ferrari, and that was part of their negotiation always. And they still do, but it's much less. And then the historically successful teams would get more, and there was a sort of long tail on the success bonus, as how you could call it. And teams like Mercedes would say, well, we've been around a long time winning, we should get more money, right? So what Chase needed to do to make the sport commercially sustainable was convince those top people, if you like, the top half of the grid.
And sorry,
To,
Matt, can I just, this was the Concord Agreement, or is that what we're
well,
coming to now?
it was, yes, it was the later versions of, because that's
Yeah.
existed since the 1980s. But yeah, the ones that, if you like, Chase Carey first was pushing through was, look, I can double the size of the pie, which by the way he has, if you'll all accept smaller slices. Your overall will be much better, but you have to accept that the playing field is more level, because if you make the playing field more level, the sport's going to be better. And and that's come true because we've seen championships that have been much more closely fought. And I think last year we had 7 different winners, and that hadn't been seen for a long time. So it was all about saying to the people that had the advantage, give up some of your advantage, and you'll be better off, and so will everybody. And now all 10 teams, I think it's correct to say, are commercially sustainable on the money they get from the sport plus the sponsorship, and that wasn't the case 5 years ago for sure.
Does the pie increase if they were to add a couple of teams? How do the economics work if they were to? I mean, is there room on the grid for 12 teams, for example?
This is a debate, and that's why for the Cadillac team to come in next year, as it is in 2026, they're having to not only spend all the money to build the infrastructure, which is extremely complicated to design and manufacture 2 cars to go racing 24 times a year, but also they have to pay what's called an anti-dilution fee to offset the fact that there are now 11 people sharing the pie. And Is it going to work out? Their argument is if we come in, we're going to add to the overall scale of the pie because we're Cadillac, US market, and so on. I think there's quite a lot of skepticism about that. And there's a lot of people that would like to bring in the 12th team. And it's obvious why people want to own a team, because teams have become, as you mentioned, valuable assets, right? So teams used to go from being, I think when Williams well, I think when Lawrence Stroll bought the Racing Point team, as it was called that time, or it was called Force India and it turned into Racing Point, I think he paid £1 to then take on the debt. And the
Yeah.
team must be worth at least $1 billion and probably closer to two for various reasons. But still, on the other hand, to your point about valuations, I think it's right that a top Premier League team or European Champions League team is probably worth five. That teams in American sport are often, 5 to 8 billion.
Plus,
So
plus, right?
plus plus. So why would Mercedes F1 or let's use McLaren and Red Bull, because Mercedes and Ferrari have other elements to their brand, right?
Yeah.
McLaren is a racing team. If McLaren is only worth $3 billion, okay, that's interesting. If it's now a franchise holder, because before Formula One there were 10 teams, but that wasn't really restricted. It was just that there were no more than 10 companies that could operate. There was some restriction in the regulations. I think 24 is the
So,
maximum number of cars currently, but
so a big part of pie expansion is, and you've mentioned sort of the introduction of a Cadillac team, and obviously we've now got three races in the US.
mm.
Has Formula One done what was always seemed the impossible and conquered the US market? And how will Formula One coexist with their domestic NASCAR business?
So I think the answer is yes and no, which is that it's a bit like the Bernie Ecclestone story earlier.
Yeah.
5, 6 years ago, let's say pre-Liberty, if you had approached the chief marketing officer of a global company led out of the US, if you'd approached an American CMO to talk about Formula One, generally there wasn't that much interest. The very same people today, if you approach them, are interested in Formula One because they now see it around them. And this is a human behavior, isn't it? I think if you approach a Chinese company and you talk about Formula One, they're not very interested because they don't think it's popular globally, because they're in China, they see the Olympics and I'm simplifying it. They see the Olympics, they see the NBA, they see Premier League and other football, right? So one of the great things that Liberty's done is by making Formula One more visible in the US, it's brought a lot of US companies into the sport because it's cool now and it's a good thing to be associated with.
And what's the sort of brand differential that sort of F1 offers to American sponsors versus NASCAR offering to American sponsors?
Yeah, well, I think the key thing is that NASCAR is, by the way, fantastic and has 3 to 4 times the audience for each of its 36 races than Formula One would get for each of its 24 on television, of course, that
Yeah.
is. So it gets 3 to 4 million viewers. F1's now doing just over 1 million, which doesn't
In the
sound like a
US.
lot in the
Yep.
US. Yeah, it's doing what, and you I have to kind of compare apples with apples, right? And the TV audience in the US has doubled since Liberty took over. So from a low base to just over 1 million. But one of the problems with the product from that point of view, from the consumer point of view, is there's only 3 races in the US. There's only 6 in if you like, the Americas time zone. All the others are somewhat inconvenient, right? So I think, but to answer your question, NASCAR is very much a consumer media platform. It works great for those brands, and you see the brands that are in NASCAR, they tend to be B2C brands. Formula One can do both global B2C and it can do B2B. And that's because Formula One is seen as more premier, because we race in Singapore and Monaco and Miami and Las Vegas. But it's also such a complicated endeavor. There's 1,000 people designing and building a technical product in a tightly regulated environment and then iterating it every hour of every day. And so, yes, you can talk to the endemic brands, the fuel and lubes companies, the tire companies, the automotive OEMs, and so on about a story. But you can also talk to a logistics company. You can talk to a technology firm. And more these days, when you see the press announcement, the company is saying, we're actually going to help the Formula One team do their job better. And by the way, they're helping us also do our job better because we're learning from the Formula One way of doing things. So
That's really interesting, because I was going to, I remember sort of in the 70s and 80s, most of the sponsors were sort of cigarette companies and lubricant oil, sort of Castrol GTX and Marlboro cigarettes. I mean, so what is the what's I mean, going to your day job, what is the core brand pitch around, well, not just F1, but around motorsports generally?
So I think it's um, it starts with eyeballs, and there's different people for different stories, right? But because it does have these 800 million fans, because every Grand Prix is watched by 70 odd million people across the globe, there's 1.6 billion cumulative audience. You've got nice big numbers that people pay attention to. And then we can debate whether actually branding on a race car or even on the side of a circuit does have value. It has some value, certainly. But that's something that's been around since the 1960s when tobacco first started being involved, and Castro and these other guys. And then hospitality is the same. It's been around forever. It's a much nicer offering, and there's different layers of it now, but it's basically the same concept. Which is if you spend a day at the races with your customers, I mean, there's a stat that Formula One tells us about, which is 1.9 times more likely to do business with their host if they've been to a Grand Prix with them. Then there's the storytelling part, which I just touched on before, which is you can either say we're involved in Formula One because it's logistically challenging and we're all about challenging logistics. Or you can go deeper and say we're actually doing the logistics, or we're doing the data transfer, or we're doing the whatever. So the storytelling part is more and more important for modern day marketers, and F1 speaks to that well. And then and that's whether you're B2B or B2C. And then a more recent element, which I've seen a lot talking to brands, is it's internal, it's employer brand. It's either more recently, we're a technology company and we're trying to attract and retain talent, and we're up against the Googles and the Amazons and these, if you like, sexy brands. We need to refresh our company and make a clear statement. So that's very valuable. Or it might be, hey, and this is what GSK, the pharma company, did with Formula One some years ago, which was if we could take some of the essence of Formula One's way of operating and address it to our tens of thousands of employees, there would be an uplift in productivity. This is what they were able to
Well, I mean,
achieve.
it's one of the most impressive logistics exercises on the planet,
It
moving
is.
this dog and pony show around the world 24 times a year. I mean, it's
Yeah,
extraordinary.
it is. So, that's, my view on it is, as somebody who's in the business, is a little bit like when I was racing. Why would anybody spend money on me going motor racing? That was the question that with a very difficult answer. What I needed to do was talk to people about what they need. Did they need to have exposure in the media? Did they want to bring people to races? Did they need to meet somebody in particular? And then try and find a way to achieve that in my racing. And that's what I do today, is I'm talking to brands not about motorsport, but about their business. What are the objectives they're trying to achieve? What do they think the activities are that are going to get them there? Marketing activities, sales activities, internal. And then I go away and think, okay, how can we apply motorsport, F1
So,
or other, to that?
but in terms of the numbers, I mean, so let's talk about sort of branding real estate around a car, whether it's a logo on the front of Lando Norris's helmet or taking over entire sort of aerofoil or the side of the car. I mean, what kind of numbers are we talking about in terms of these sponsorship deals?
Well, simple in a sense is that, if you want to get into the sport, it's, I would say, a few $100,000 might get you a brand ambassador relationship with a driver, which wouldn't include any branding, through to, if you want to be title partner of Ferrari as HPR, you're probably spending 75 million
Right.
dollars, euros. At that point, it kind of doesn't matter, right? But you're spending that kind of number, and there's a lot of branding involved in that, and quite a lot of brand awareness. And then sort of in the middle, I think what's also happened is that some teams have decided actually it's better if we have fewer bigger spenders because we can take care of them more. And that's a more recent phenomenon as well, because there is now a queue of people that want to come into the sport. It's much easier for the teams to say, let's be a bit more selective, which is great.
Yeah.
And also saying, actually, of course, a logo on a race car is nice and has some value, but do you really need that? Because if you don't, we'd rather you don't have it and that we give you the assets you really need, and our car doesn't look like a Christmas tree. So, there's a sliding scale between 300 and 80 million.
Yeah, I mean, what is the the premier sponsorship asset? I mean, I guess it's a. I mean, is it at the race level or is it at the car level?
Well, there's a few things, isn't there? Again, this is it's debatable. So I would say, I think, depending on who you are and what you're trying to do, generally speaking, association with Formula One is super, that gives you super, that's 80% of the value. And you can get it for 20% of the price, or you can get it for 120% of the price, right? So if you can associate yourself, let's say, with Ferrari, that's super valuable. Now, whether you have a logo on the car or not, does it really make much difference? I don't think it does, frankly. I think, and I often say to brands, let's go with the correct partner for your brand. It might not be Ferrari, by the way. It might be, if you're a challenger brand, you should be with a different team. On the other hand, you might say what we're really trying to achieve now is a lot of global brand awareness. And if you become a global partner of Formula One, what you're getting typically is a lot of real estate around the racetrack and on the
Right.
TV broadcast. And that can be very valuable. So yeah. I think a great thing about Formula One at the moment now is that it's like the Champions League football, which is there's no bad team. So
Yeah.
any team you're involved with in any way brings you into a very exclusive environment.
That's clever. Now, I'm noticed sitting over your shoulder, and we've talked about this. About you've got a sim rig behind you, and I know that sort of sim racing is something that's almost sort of creeping into the broader sort of, well, motorsports certainly, but even F1 world. I mean the experiment with sort of promoting sim races into real seats has already happened once. So we're going to see more of that. And I'm also beginning to wonder if there might be a sort of commercial opportunity in sim racing. Whether that's through the hardware, whether that's through
Mm.
probably the gaming aspect of it, as in the gambling aspect of it. There are plenty of avenues into it, but I'd love your perspective on this whole sim world.
Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, personally, I used to race, as we talked about. And what I discovered was that post race, I would feel extremely relaxed and my head was sort of clean. And because I'd been focusing on one thing to the exclusion of all else, because you needed to, otherwise you'd be in hospital. And that is something you don't find typically in life. And I think some people can get it out of yoga and that sort of activity. And actually I found yoga so difficult that I did also experience it in yoga. But anyway, the point is, the reason I got a sim was that actually when I'm driving the simulator, especially if I'm racing with other people, is I get that same experience of focusing on one thing to the exclusion of all else. And of course it's something I love, and therefore when I'm using it, my imagination is drawing a three-dimensional picture in my brain. And it is, driving a racing car isn't about reaction, it's about anticipation if you're doing it properly. And it's super cerebral. It's working out what you're doing into the corner, but it's also working out what you're going to be doing the next corner, the next lap, later in the race, right? So that's the reason I do it. And a lot of people I know who race the kind of simulator I've got, which is, quite a lot of
You
technology and it's
don't
quite
do the
expensive.
VR headset thing. You go with
I,
the big screens.
I don't, but friends of mine do, and what I've heard is if you go to VR, you don't go back. And
Right.
so that's kind of one of the reasons why I haven't tried it, because I fear that if I do, I'll then have a sweaty headset. I quite like not having the sweaty headset. But anyway, so that's great. The other thing about simulators, and motorsport is I think, compared to any other sport, it's the closest to reality. In that, we use a steering wheel, we got pedals. A simulated tennis match wouldn't be anywhere near as, or football or anything else. So it's brilliant,
Yeah.
and it's definitely a training tool for people that want to either get into the sport, or like Max Verstappen is one of the best sim racers in the world. It's he's famous for being at a Grand Prix weekend, and suddenly somebody says, he's racing at the Nürburgring in the virtual world. Well, I think he was at Miami 2 weeks ago, and he happened to be doing this online race in, online. So there's
But
that. Yeah.
it's another revenue vertical for the industry, certainly, isn't it? I mean,
I don't know. That's the bit I'm unsure about, Rupert, because I think the problem with it is that you do need a certain amount of hardware and
right.
space and all of those things. And so to do it in that way, any form of sim racing, it's not like a game. It's somewhere between a game and a tool. And the numbers of people that are doing it, yeah, I mean, there's thousands of people enjoying it, but I don't think it's anything like the other online games.
The other sort of
There's
fighting games which fill Korean football stadiums and that things like that.
And that's the key point, isn't it? Is that nobody I know watches other people racing, online racing.
But
You so
they watch the World of Warcraft or whatever the other, they do that.
yes,
You fill
they do.
stadiums doing that.
Exactly. And that's the key difference. And Formula One has a sim racing championship, but I don't know anybody who actually watches it. Now,
Right.
from a sponsorship point, by the way, from a commercial point of view, if you want to come into the sport and you want to be associated with Formula One, that is a good value way of getting association with, especially if there's if you can link up your hardware or software or whatever. So I see a value in it, but I don't think in itself it's going to become a thing.
Perfect. Well, Matt, what I wanted to do was first just allow, how can you help get people into the sponsorship world? And
Mm.
then because it's Monaco Grand Prix weekend, I want some of your Fox Sports punditry just to wrap us up.
Okay. So what do we do? What we try to do is at EDJ is we try to help people have confidence in the decisions they're making about an investment. It's very similar to what you do. And we're very specialists. We only work in motorsport. We're a group of experts. And what we try to do, first of all, as I said earlier, is, let's start with the non-motorsport. What are your objectives? What are your activities that are going to get you there? Okay, now we can start thinking about, would it be, if you're a clothing brand selling into the US, you might want to be in NASCAR because you want the TV broadcast, So where do you need to be? And it might be more than one. And do you need to be with the league because of the assets the league can offer you that you can plug into those sales and marketing activities? Are you better with a team or with an athlete, or indeed with the media company that broadcasts, or something else peripheral? I mean, the Gunter Steiner example. Gunter is a brand ambassador for Buffalo Trace Bourbon. And that was, an answer to the question from Buffalo Trace Bourbon was, how do we get into Formula One and various things? And we came away and thought, actually, what they need is a human rather than a car. And Gunter was the perfect answer to that question. It takes a while to get there.
He's the perfect answer to most questions in Formula One, isn't he?
Gunter is, and he gives the perfect answer to most questions. So we're trying to do that, trying to confidence in decision making, which includes some protection, because these are big investments. And I think having somebody on side who's entirely independent, knows all the rights holders and can make the phone calls and get the inside information and predict to some degree the future, but also say, look, things go wrong. So you need to have, if you like, somebody who's given you that advice and also pointed out where things, where you might need to react in the future.
Perfect. Well, it's Monaco weekend. It's pundit time. I'm getting you back to your old job, Matt. I've just put up on the screen for those of you that are just listening the latest Polymarket odds for the Monaco winner this weekend, but also I think the head-to-head matchups within teams, which I think are quite fun. I've put Matt completely on the spot here, but I mean, first question is, according to the odds, McLaren now 93% locked in to win the Constructors' Championship for this year. Would you dare sell that market? Seven points of downside, 93 of up.
No, I think you'd be very brave because, as we know, but maybe some of your listeners don't, the drivers' championship is each of the 20 drivers scores points at every race, and then the combined points of the two drivers in each team goes to the constructors' championship. And Red Bull has the best driver on the grid, in my opinion, and is doing very well because of that. But their second driver, which seems to rotate, is typically not a scorer. So you wouldn't want to bet on Red Bull, and there's nobody else really close, I don't think. So no, I think I would stick with McLaren on that one.
So this weekend, what's looking like is a McLaren 1-2 with Piastri Norris, and they're at sort of 32% and 26% respectively, with Max Verstappen at 23%. Difficult race, Monaco, for overtaking. You're going to want to mess with these odds. I mean, we're recording this on Friday, so pre-practice, pre-qualifying.
I think the only thing I would say is it won't be like that because always something happens at Monaco typically. And there's another thing, which is that for the first time almost ever, but certainly at Monaco, there are regulations on the number of pit stops you must have. So Monaco used to be, they would you would try to do the minimum number of pit stops, which normally was one, because to your point, track position trumped everything else. Because you could have a car that was 5 seconds a lap faster than the guy in front, but you're not going to get past because the track is so narrow. So, even Daniel Ricciardo, who won it in, I want to say 2018 or 2019, with a car that was 25% down on power, but nobody could overtake him. So, but this year, to overcome this predictability of the race, you have to make 2 pit stops. And so something is going to happen, because every time you make a pit stop, you're throwing the dice as, does the safety car come out and now you have benefited, or you haven't? And with 2 of those, of course, that's doubled. And it certainly affects McLaren more than anybody else if you look at that chart, because they have to pit 2 cars each time. And there might be a perfect moment. The safety car comes out, jump into the pits, but which person jumps in? And if you try to do both guys and they're running nose to tail, one of them is going to lose 5 seconds. So that's the problem for McLaren,
And any interesting in the teammate head-to-heads? Anything mispriced up there to your mind?
Well, they're not
I
really
think
teammates, are
Alonso
they?
versus Stroll's hilarious. I'm surprised
Yeah,
it's not higher, but I guess that's the
yeah.
randomness of Monaco.
And also Lance has this ability, just as you're writing him off, to do something that's quite exceptional. And, I can imagine him in the rain at Monaco, either being amazing or terrible. It's very hard to predict.
Oh, is it
Um,
forecast to rain this weekend? I didn't know that.
no, I think Friday, maybe a little bit. I think it's going to be dry. But, I think the thing about this weekend is the McLaren has the strongest car. The Ferrari has the weakest car for these slow corners. Red Bull, we don't know, because Max is, from another world. And then something else will happen. And it could be that Kimi Antonelli puts the car on pole, and then he's in the lead, and it rains halfway through. You don't know. That's the other thing about the weather in Monaco, because of where it is geographically on the coast there with the mountains behind it.
Yeah.
The weather can change in a few hours. So I think I
Well,
managed to avoid answering your question in a definitive way.
no, that's all right. That's all right. As long as not as long as you're going to get into trouble with William Hill or any other bookmaker.
Yeah,
And apologies for sharing the poly market odds to anyone that might mind. Um, Matt, thank you so much for coming on the Squirrel Pod. I will make sure that anyone that wants to get in touch with you can either come to me directly or put all of the details of EDJ in the show notes. But thanks again. It's been great having you on, and I look forward to seeing you next time you're down in Melbourne for the Grand Prix. If not, I'll
great
come
pleasure.
see you in Singapore. Okay,
Fantastic. Thanks,
take
Rupert.
care.
Appreciate it.